All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where in the country you are. Welcome to our session on COVID-19 and retinoblastoma. The intention of this session is to address questions about COVID-19 and retinoblastoma by RB experts for our community. And our clinicians have received many questions about COVID-19 in relationship to RB. And so they asked the Canadian Retinoblastoma Research Advisory Board to host a call so that all members of our community can hear the answers. And so thanks for joining us today, wherever you are in the country, or maybe if we have a few international people, that always tends to happen as well. Welcome to the party. My name is JQ. I'll kick off with giving you a bit of a view of the vaccine resources we just have available to families and across the board. There's quite a lot of links to resources. In general, you can just hit up rbcanadaresearch.com and that'll actually link out to a lot of Health Canada links and that sort of thing. And so yeah. As we dig in, just to give you a bit of a view of the next 60 minutes, and by the way, I'll kind of be looking this way because that's where my screen is. We'll kind of go over introductions about who our clinicians are. We'll dig into a bit of a poll just to get a bit of a scan of the room, dive into a bit of background about the composition of vaccines, DNA, mRNA, and the proteins, and so really excited for that. And then spend a bit of time going through Q&A. And so Q&A will kind of split up into two. Because we had so many questions that kind of came up before the session, what we did was we tried to consolidate them thematically. And then, so we'll go through those. If anything does come up while we do chat and you're thinking, hey, I actually have a question, feel free to raise your hand using the Zoom functionality or throw it in the chat, which I'll monitor here on this screen as well. And we'll do it that way. Sound good? Everyone's stoked? I've got my Tim Hortons, so I'm ready to go. In terms of introductions, we'll dive right in. I'm, as I mentioned, my name is JQ. I do work in the healthcare industry, particularly on the digital health space over at TELUS Health. But when it comes to CRAB, I sit on the West Coast Regional Working Group. And so once a month, we get to hang out. Maybe it's actually a bit more often than that. And we dig into research that's ongoing. We try to decipher what research means in terms of the papers and that sort of thing. I'll actually let our clinicians introduce themselves if that's okay. That way I'm not butchering any intros. But Dr. Malapatna, let's pass it over to you.
Yeah, hi, my name is Ashwin Malapatna. I'm one of the ophthalmologists that treat retinoblastoma at SickKids in Toronto. And I'm also a member of the of CRAB, leading the group on early detection of retinoblastoma.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Malapatna. Dr. Sheikh.
Thanks, Jay. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me today. My name is Furkan Sheikh. I'm a pediatric oncologist at SickKids Hospital, and I'm the primary oncologist as part of the retinoblastoma team. Awesome.
Thanks for being here today, both of you. Really, really excited to hear all of your wisdom and insights. Maybe, Ivana, if you could help me launch the poll. We're going to kick off with 4 questions just to get a sense of the audience in terms of like who's on this call today. The poll is not for research purposes. It's really to give our clinicians a bit of a lens as to who's in the room so that they can tailor their answers accordingly. So the first question here, you'll actually see quite a few pop up. So feel free to answer accordingly. And I'm just going to shift it over so that I can also answer the poll. But you'll see about 4 questions up there. I'll give you about a minute to fill that out. All right, Ivana, can you see how many people have kind of progress through, or are we missing a few? Or
We have 4 out of the 9 that are on the call. I can't fill that out myself, but just give it a few more, just a minute, and I'm sure whoever can do the poll will finish it by then. Otherwise, please let us know and we'll hold it up longer.
Thank you.
Under the, am I going to get my child vaccinated? I had to answer, I prefer not to say because I don't have any children. So I hope that it wouldn't let me submit without checking something off there.
Okay, thanks for the heads up. Next time we'll make a not applicable selection box. That is a good call out.
Thanks for saying that, because I couldn't submit either and didn't know why. Okay.
You're like, this poll's broken. All right, let's wrap up. If we could show the results of that just before we dig in, so it's kind of frame who's in the room. Ivana, can you pull up the results? Perfect. So I'll share my screen, and you should probably see it in front of you as well. We've got about a third health professionals and survivors, so both, and then split up between researchers and parents too, and then an advocate as well. People are informed. Good. We're all coming into this this conversation somewhat or very informed. A lot of people are vaccinated. Some people prefer not to answer. Totally fine. Awesome. So hopefully that helps. One of the things, just on this last question here, or the second last question here, regards to where are you getting your information, it was interesting because I like the fact that we could have checked off multiple answers, and I found that I get my information from literally everywhere, the depths of the internet to, you know, posters and billboards. So and then for the last question, interesting, right? Like a majority not concerned that we'll be harmed, and then some people, you know, TBD. So with that lens, let's dig in. Thankful that all of you are here to kind of learn. And so in terms of kicking us off, would love to dig into a bit of a background on just information in general. And so I believe Dr. Malapatna, are you running this part?
Yeah, just a brief introduction to what exists out there. And I must say that, you know, I'm not an expert on vaccines, but I am a medical professional. And I think amongst the group here, maybe Furkan and I would be the closest to being knowledgeable about vaccines, perhaps in a professional way. And therefore, we decided to take up this responsibility. There are many resources that are available, as Jay and Ivana have pointed out before this, specifically the ones that are curated for this purpose. And a link to that is accessible through the CRAB website that's out in the chat box. So with that mentioned, and perhaps allowing you to explore more information through there, I'll just give you the brief of what we're going to talk about today, which is basically mRNA vaccines and whether they have any impact on survivors of retinoblastoma. I think to start this off, it's just a brief background about what proteins are and what how they come about. DNA is a specific code that's inside the nucleus of all the cells of our body, and this code codes for all of the proteins that get formed. And the way these proteins, and basically these proteins are all the building blocks of everything that we have. So our skin and our guts and our eyes and everything is made out of proteins. And there are different kinds of proteins, and they have different functions based on their shape, their structure, how they interact with other molecules in the body. and how they interact with even non-protein molecules in the body. For example, oxygen is delivered by a protein that's called hemoglobin, and we all know about that. So those are the kinds of examples of proteins that exist in the body. You know, they could be your nails are proteins, your hair are proteins, everything in you is basically a protein, and it can interact with different things based on how it's shaped and how it is situated. And that's just a very, let's say, high level view of this. I would say a very, very, very high level view of this. What the mRNA comes into place over there, because for a protein to exist or for a protein to be generated inside each of these cells, the DNA forms small RNA pieces called the mRNA, which then goes on to make proteins. These proteins can then go on to do their specific functions in most cases. But with the specific vaccine that we're talking about, which is the vaccine against COVID-19, mRNA became one of those things that we could introduce into the body in such a way that the body looks only at the mRNA. So the body doesn't have that in its code at all, doesn't have it in its DNA, will not acquire it into its DNA through an mRNA. And the mRNA then goes on to code these specific proteins that resemble that of the virus. And in this case, it's a specific spike protein that was targeted as something that could be a way to start getting at the virus. Why do we want to do this? Because as soon as we start to make those proteins, the body then the immune system then recognizes those specific proteins as proteins that don't belong in the body. Eventually those proteins are, the body develops a line of defense against those proteins. So whenever those proteins come back again, and maybe if someone gets infected by the virus, then those proteins are presented more to the body. Therefore, the body generates an immune response against those viruses based on what it remembers from these proteins that were introduced to it as a vaccine. So that's the long and short of what's out there in the image and in text. I might stop here to just ask if anyone has any questions about this process, or we can go forward to the submitted Q&As that we got so far.
Okay, it looks like no one's thrown up any questions, so we can dive in to the questions. So just as a quick reminder, raise hand or chat, and we'll dig into the submitted questions first. I thought I might actually stop sharing screen so that we could all look at each other while we dig into these questions, if that's okay. But first question, and I'll kind of throw this in the chat so you can all see it as well. But how is the COVID-19 vaccine, developed and tested? And maybe I'll throw that over to Dr. Malapatna to kick off.
Sure. So the COVID-19 vaccine was developed, well, from what I know, again, the COVID-19 vaccine has been developed in with the mRNA sort of technology that's been brewing in the background, the mRNA vaccine technology that's been brewing in the background. But mRNAs themselves are not new to us. We've known about mRNA since maybe the 60s or maybe even earlier than that. This is a nice new cool way of using an mRNA that was developed through these years after they started to figure, maybe I would say in the last 10 years or so, when they started to explore that as perhaps an option to develop a vaccine with. And that blew out with the COVID vaccine because there was an urgent need to make a vaccine, and that technology that was already ready in the back could very easily then be tested and could be moved forward into clinical use. The testing itself is standard, which is basically 3 phases of testing. The phase 1 is safety. Phase 2 is whether it's efficacious, which means whether it does what it's promised to do. And phase 3 is when it can be compared and the long-term outcomes are looked at. And we really look at all of the, let's say, the intricacies of what really happens when a person is vaccinated, and how the vaccine affects the virus or the body to generate its immunity against the virus. And these 3, let's say, phases of a clinical trial are standard, and that has been rigorously brought into place by the licensing authorities for each of these drugs. So in Canada, it would be Health Canada, and in the US, it would be FDA. There are other such agencies all around the world, and each of these agencies take an independent look at what has been tested. And it's usually the drug company that does the testing, but the results of the testing is scrutinized by these agencies before bringing it upon being used clinically. So I think that's the long and the short of how it was developed and how it was tested.
Yeah, and thanks for that answer. I guess as a quick follow to that, to your point about the 3rd stage being, long-term outcomes and effects. Some people's concerns in the past were, oh, it seems like we're actually pushing this vaccine out, to your point, faster than we've ever done before. Are there any concerns that you would have from that point of view at all?
So those were very early and initial and good concerns, and we're all obviously concerned about what we want to put into our body. And if something was tested quickly, we want to know whether the quality of testing was maintained. I am personally convinced with the quality of testing that the vaccine has gone through for the 1st phase and the 2nd phase. And I know that the adoption was made early, and rightly so, from my opinion, because of an urgent need to protect the people in a way that we have never required a need like this before, or we perhaps have required it and not fared so well before. So I think the speed at which it was developed is just a sign of the maturity of our system, and not really a concern for the safety of these trials.
Awesome. Thanks for that answer. Statistically, it's we're at this point where about a bit over 85% of our Canadians above the age of 5 are now fully vaccinated, and so it's just we're all at this point where nothing has shown up long term to be that negative, apart from like a few disparate data
and
points.
we do know what's shown up as well. We do know that some vaccines have a risk for clots and those sorts of things, which we've learned over time. And those sorts of things are known for even other vaccines, like or polio vaccines, which have vaccine-induced paralysis as well.
Yeah.
And the those sorts of vaccines have even allowed to eradicate polio in many countries where polio was a big issue. And even the smallpox vaccine, for example, was the testing for the smallpox vaccine. If you look back at it, has really been one person taking a pox from or taking fluid out of a pox from a milkmaid's hand, and using that fluid to inoculate a child, and then exposing that child to smallpox and making sure that the child doesn't get smallpox. Now, this was well before the phases of testing and everything in the history of how vaccines were invented. If you look at that technology and how we're using technology to test our vaccines now, I would feel much safer to receive the vaccine that's been tested now rather than the little pox fluid that came out in the development of vaccines in general. But even that vaccine has helped eradicate smallpox as a disease in the entire world. And that sort of shows you the power of that kind of a vaccine, let's say.
Thank you for that answer. And what a great segue. So you had brought up, blood clots and particular vaccines and the risk there. Dr. Sheikh, maybe over to you. A bit of an easy one, but first two-parter. One, would you recommend the vaccine for RB patients in particular? And number two, which vaccine would you suggest for RB survivors? And is it okay to mix vaccines at all, given things like blood clots?
All right, thanks, Jay, for that question. So I think probably Ashwin and I both agree that in general, we would recommend the COVID vaccination for all our patients with retinoblastoma, those either currently going through therapy or in close follow-up, or are survivors of retinoblastoma, to essentially for the same reasons that we would recommend it for all our other cancer patients, but also for ourselves and our family members and our children. The balance of sort of pros and cons and risks and concerns from both the vaccine or from the COVID disease is essentially not very different when we think about patients with cancer or survivors of cancer versus everyone else in the general population. So we would recommend the vaccine for those same reasons, which is essentially that number one, of course, we've all seen COVID itself is a disease we want to try to avoid to catch. We do know, thankfully, that age is a risk factor and young age is a protective factor. So for children who are 5 to 11 years old, very fortunately, the disease is relatively milder and short-lived. Having said that, there is a rate of hospitalizations and complications somewhere for young children, somewhere in the vicinity of 1 in 300 COVID diseases will result in hospitalizations. A small portion of those will be ICU, and thankfully a very small proportion of those could result in mortality. But when the technology is available to prevent that with much, much lower rates of complications, then every medical decision is really a balancing of pros and cons. And so with the COVID vaccine, we believe, based on the medical evidence available, that the pros do outweigh many of the cons and concerns, which we can talk about in a bit. So I would generally recommend the COVID vaccine to, especially to older adults and to adults, and as well as to the new Pfizer vaccine being approved for 5 to 11-year-olds. I would recommend that for that age group. And sorry, Jay, could you repeat the second part of your question?
Yeah. Is there a particular one that you would suggest for RB patients? And what are your thoughts on mixing it? Is it okay to, or should we not be doing that?
For young patients, for the 5 to 11, at the moment, we only have the Pfizer vaccine approved, only because that's the one whose clinical trial has been published recently. Other vaccines may come along soon. For older patients where we have the Pfizer, Moderna, and other vaccines, once again, Pfizer and Moderna seem to be the one that perhaps have the most common acceptance and perhaps the safety profile. And to the question of mixing and matching, that's a difficult one for me to answer. We may want to use sort of our vaccine experts for that. Perhaps as much as possible, if possible, to get the same vaccine as two in the series, that's preferred. But if, for example, whether due to shortage reasons or emergency reasons, mixing needs to be pursued, we've seen that is efficacious as well.
Thank you. Dr. Malapatna, maybe back over to you. Do mRNA vaccines in general, like the COVID-19 vaccine, do they affect patients' DNA at all and cause cancer or RB? Does that come up as a risk at all?
I think I should answer that question cautiously. With specific pertinence to the COVID-19 vaccine, we know that the mRNA is generating a spike protein, a protein that doesn't exist in the body at all in any way. Therefore, I firmly believe that spike protein has no effect to the patient's DNA itself, because an mRNA, in the way the biology is that it doesn't back translate into a DNA if it's a spike protein. That being said, as I said, there are proteins that can do many things. So if you introduce an mRNA of a certain nature, then it may be used to alter cancers in some way in the future, in a good way, hopefully in the future. But that is not about the COVID vaccine at all. These mRNAs generate different proteins, And the protein that's been generated by the COVID-19 vaccine has perhaps nothing to do with cancers or retinoblastoma specifically. So I'm not concerned that these vaccines would in any way increase the risk of developing retinoblastoma or second cancers for people who are at risk with retinoblastoma.
Yeah, and that's on like the causing of, any kind of illness from the vaccine. What about affecting a patient with currently, RB, or even a survivor with RB? Does your answer change at any point with that lens?
There are times when you don't want to develop a vaccine-related fever. For example, when a child has low neutrophils from the effects of chemotherapy, which Furkan can perhaps elaborate a little bit more about. And those types of times, we don't think these vaccines might be as effective. But does it affect does it affect retinoblastoma itself? I would have to say no in general.
Yeah, and I can add to that. It's a very common question that people ask us, families and patients, because we all know the RB1 gene mutation is a mutation in the DNA. And now we hear this vaccine is made of RNA, and those two we know are molecules that are related. So I think it's a very good and natural question to wonder about is can they interact in some way? And the answer generally is no. As Dr. Malipatna explained at the beginning, DNA is a sort of fixed molecule that exists inside the nucleus of our cell. Its job is to sort of unzip and create mRNA, which in turn creates protein. But if we inject sort of this viral RNA into our bloodstream, our body is using that floating RNA to make new proteins sort of outside the nucleus of the cell. That process happens in the cytoplasm of the cell or outside. And so there's not this physical interaction. The RNA is not going into the nucleus of the cell. And even if it did, it's not becoming DNA. It's not reverse transcribing itself into DNA, and it's not incorporating itself into the DNA molecule. So it's almost as if, although the words are the same, they're happening on two different planes of machinery within the cell. And so we know that from, it's not as if we can't pull up a paper that will show you that, but we know that from the basic understanding of the underlying biology and the mechanism of how the cell biology works. So although it's a very good question that those two words are related, they're not interacting with each other at a cellular level. And the other important thing is that RNA that is injected through the vaccine, of course, it does its job to make those proteins, but RNA has a very short shelf life. So it sort of decays very quickly. It does its job and it goes away, essentially. And then those spike proteins that are made stimulate the immune system. But then those spike proteins decay and go away as well. So the actual product of the vaccine doesn't linger in our body for very long. But the immune system, the B cells of the immune system that have now seen this spike protein, develop what's called immune memory. So they develop antibodies and memory so that the next time a true infection comes along, the immune system is able to mount its response, its reaction to that infection faster because of this memory. So because of all of that, we don't think that whether it be RB gene mutation or really any other genetic disorder, there's not any interaction with the RNA vaccine for that reason of the mechanism of cell biology.
Yeah, that's a very comprehensive answer, Dr. Sheikh, and really appreciate that that response. Would be curious then to kind of shift the conversation a little bit. We've talked a lot about impact or relationship between vaccine and us, but let's talk about COVID-19 for a little bit. So I would be curious, hypothetically, I get diagnosed with COVID, and what kind of effect would that diagnosis have on me as a patient, either in terms of like the current treatment that I could get or future treatment? And so to elaborate a little bit on that, maybe like what impact could COVID have on my treatment appointments, impact on genetics, maybe like tumor growth? Dr. Sheikh, I'll pass that off to you.
Sure, good. That's a great question. We can sort of take different aspects of that question. I mean, the first priority would be to make sure you're well from the COVID disease itself. So we would want to make sure that you're well supported through that. As I mentioned, thankfully, young children do very well. Middle-aged adults also do well. But if you were to have a more severe COVID infection, we would want to, of course, assess that and treat that as necessary. And occasionally that requires hospitalizations or medications. But thankfully, for many young children, and retinoblastoma patients often tend to be young children, will sort of get through the COVID disease, thankfully, within a few days and be healthy again. During the time of that COVID positivity, however, there can be sort of impacts on their treatment, delivery, or care. For one thing, as you heard Dr. Ashwin say, if a child is febrile or unwell, it may result in delays in their chemotherapy delivery or in their ophthalmologic exams under anesthesia. Anesthesia is more risky and more dangerous in someone who is experiencing a respiratory viral illness because the anesthesia itself induces bronchospasm, etc. So our anesthesiologists generally will not want to put a child under an anesthesia for EUA if they're currently going through a symptomatic viral infection. And they'll generally recommend waiting at least 2 weeks from the end of the infection before anesthesia. So so the first impact is the illness itself, and the second impact is likely delays in the ability to continue with therapy for a short duration of time. There's a third impact, which is almost related to our protective, administrative systems. Our hospitals are very, actively engaged in ensuring that we ourselves don't become, sources of transmission of the illness. And so there's a lot of care to make sure people who have COVID, are not able to share that with others during their hospital visit. And so, as you all know, when you come to hospital, there's a lot of lines and questionnaires to come through. And so, having COVID infection could technically, of course, a child who has COVID, we would never use that to limit their care. If they needed care, they would come. But for example, a parent who has COVID may not be allowed to accompany the child during that illness. And we've had, for example, challenges if, for example, families commute via taxi or ambulance. We've had challenges with transportation if someone is COVID positive. So those are sort of little logistical challenges that can come along because of COVID. We can always find a way through that, but it adds to the overall burden of healthcare that the child goes through. So that would be, I think, the immediate impact for patients who are going through active therapy. For survivors who are not sort of, necessarily having to come on a very frequent basis for the therapy, they may have annual follow-up or so. I think, of course, if they have COVID positivity, it would be easy enough to defer their clinic appointment or their EUA until a date that they're feeling better. And so for them, the top priority would be just to ensure that they're healthy through the illness.
Got it. Thank you. You had mentioned, things like going under anesthesiology, right? Similarly, I guess, does a patient's course of treatment, so let's say I'm undergoing chemotherapy, does that impact if and when I should receive a COVID vaccine?
Right, that's a good question. And so it's a bit of a tricky answer. Let me start by answering for other vaccines. So for the other routine childhood vaccines, what we generally recommend to most of our families and patients is to defer their vaccines while they're going through active chemotherapy. And that would be systemic chemotherapy because of the reduction in the immune system. So the same wouldn't apply if they were getting only intraarterial or intravitreal chemotherapy. It would be only if they were getting chemo through a port in their bloodstream and their immune system is suppressed. We generally recommend to defer vaccines until that course of chemotherapy is over. And we usually say to wait 3 months till the chemotherapy completes to resume the non-live vaccines, and to wait 12 months to resume the live vaccines. The live vaccines are the chickenpox or the MMR. COVID is a non-live vaccine, so we would recommend waiting 3 months. Now, but why do we make that recommendation? It's actually not because giving the vaccine would be dangerous during chemotherapy. It's just that it won't be fully efficacious or fully effective because of the weakening of the immune system. So one of the exceptions, for example, is the annual flu vaccine. We actually do recommend getting the annual flu vaccine, even if you're on chemotherapy, because even if the effectiveness is reduced, there's still a benefit to getting the vaccine that year, and you'll get the next version of the vaccine the next year. So it's not quite clear where COVID fits into that just yet. If COVID is going to be something where we'll need a booster every year or seasonal variation, then I would actually recommend to go ahead and get the COVID vaccine, even if you're on active chemotherapy, because of the fact that it will have some benefit for you, although reduced benefit. It will still be beneficial during that time period. Our general recommendation at SickKids is that being on chemotherapy itself is not a contraindication to getting the COVID vaccine. So it's kind of like the flu vaccine in that sense. The exceptions would be someone getting a bone marrow transplant or someone getting rituximab, where the impact on the immune system is so much that it may not make sense to get the vaccine. But the reason I say it's a tricky question is because we don't have full data, because the trials that have been done so far have not included very many cancer patients. And so we don't know, we don't have a data-based way to answer that question. But generally speaking, to summarize that long-winded answer, what I would say is, while it is possible to get the COVID vaccine while on active chemotherapy, it may have some reduced efficacy. And because RB chemo, systemic chemo is relatively short, maybe 3 months long, it's probably sensible to wait to complete the chemotherapy before beginning the vaccine.
Awesome. I'm glad you touched on booster shots too, because I think that was top of mind, but you covered it. So
okay.
Thank
Maybe
you.
I'll ask Dr. Malapatna if he agrees with that or has anything to add.
Well, I completely agree with that. And I think you said it very well. I think the question has always been, at least for some people, I've been asked this by parents in the room as well, in that, you know, if we're saying vaccines should not be given during chemotherapy, why are we saying that we should give the COVID vaccine? So that, I think you answered that question very well. And I think in general, there's a time during treatment when maybe these vaccines, it would be favorable to avoid them for other reasons, but not for the reasons that they would cause harm.
Yeah.
I think that's very well said.
And probably the last place to leave it is that if you are someone who's going through systemic chemotherapy at the moment and the opportunity to get the COVID vaccine comes along, it would be an individualized decision with your treating team. Absolutely. So if you were my patient, you would sit with me, we would discuss it together, the pros and cons and the factors at play, and we would make a decision together. But it's not an absolute contraindication. It's not a prohibition or a ban that you cannot get the COVID vaccine, even when immunocompromised.
Yeah.
Great. One thing that we're seeing across Canada now is this, and actually across the world, is this introduction of mandating vaccines across workplaces, et cetera. But I think there's a bit of a gap when it comes to what it looks like for children. And so one question that came in was, if my child is not vaccinated and vaccines are mandated, does RB care at SickKids or any other hospital for that matter, would that be affected, or would I be impacted in terms of being able to get care? And I'll pass that off to Dr. Malapatna.
Okay, that's a hard one. So I can't speak for SickKids in any way. I don't. They do have you know, their policies and their administrative reasons why they would mandate vaccinations in some way, but I don't. So far from what I know, we haven't mandated it for patients in any way. In other words, yes, we are a healthcare system that should accept RB patients in any form based on what the disease has at that particular point. So, you know, I don't think the SickKids will be the limiting factor there, and that's my belief at this point. I do think, of course, that there are other things that would come in the way, such as, you know, perhaps travel to SickKids and from SickKids is something that would need to be considered for people who are out of province or coming from far away, because a few of the airlines and other industries are actually mandating vaccination for to be able to travel. So I think that would need to be considered, and maybe those who are affected by those sorts of mandates should reach out to us, and through our social workers, we would try and put the care of their retinoblastoma right on top, and then we would, you know, talk about being vaccinated or not after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thanks for bringing up the logistical aspect of
getting
to whatever hospital, right? If I need to fly for whatever reason, that might be
right.
quite an impediment. So planning a road trip is absolutely key. That's the end of any like pre-provided questions to us. I'm curious, you know, if the audience has or participants have anything to add in terms of questions that you have for Dr. Sheikh or Dr. Malapadden at this point. I'll maybe kick off with one random one from me that came up. So I was at a digital health conference a few months ago, and one of the speakers was someone who had created or like participated in the COVID vaccine creation. And he was talking about how the mRNA vaccine, or the technology in general, is actually able to be tweaked in many ways to be customized to attack whatever or create the spike protein as necessary. And so the conversation actually stemmed outside of COVID to say, like, what else could we start to address with mRNA vaccine technology? And would be curious from your point of view, any hopes, aspirations when it comes to RB as a, I don't know, this is speaking as a non-clinician clearly, but is that something that could be, you know, tweaked to start to generate a way to address RB in a new way? I'll throw that to anyone who wants to take it.
I think Furkan should take that, because I think it may have more broad impacts on cancer in general. Is the research direction that is intended? I think the maturity of that is very far away from what it is with COVID-19, but I'll let Furkan perhaps add a lot more to that.
Yeah, maybe we'll pull in from some more experts in the audience. Dr. Damaris, for example, being that genetics experts can chime in as well. And maybe, Jay, more broadly, I think, you know, we've heard in the news a lot about gene editing technology, about things like CRISPR, et cetera. And I do think while it's still years or decades away, there's you know, potential excitement for how that could impact on genetic disorders in general. You know, it's important to mention it's very difficult to change a fully formed human's DNA in every trillion cells of the body. That's sort of not the gene editing technology we have at the moment, but we could edit, you know, single strands of DNA or genes at a sort of single cellular level. I suppose there's an potential application there in terms of if someone is conceiving children, for example, through in vitro fertilization, there could be gene editing to ensure the RB gene is not mutated. So it's a very narrow niche of applicability to RB patients, but that may be something we're talking about in 10 or 20 years. Another potential option could be, you know, in the same way that the mRNA is making spike protein, could we make normal RB protein? But once again, the challenge would be delivering that to the trillion cells or the billions of cells we have in our body. So these are, you know, they're almost on the verge of science fiction at the moment, but they're exciting and they're coming along, but they won't be immediately applicable to any of our patients at the moment. But as I said, I'll open the mic to Dr. Damaris and ask her if she has any insights on that.
I think, Furkan, you covered everything. I agree with everything you said. I have read some, you know, the retinoblastoma gene itself and the protein it produces has so many functions, and we tend to focus on, you know, its role in cell proliferation, and its absence means a tumor is able to grow. But there are also some studies showing that RB has a function in the immune response itself, and some scientists have been looking at that and what it means for immunotherapy, which is used in other types of cancers. I think melanoma has a really good immunotherapy. So maybe there is a role for this technology for the treatment of RB, but as you say, we're a long time from there. I think, you never know.
I think just out of a conceptual route, and maybe going a little bit into the science fiction that Furkan spoke about, I think it may be safer to develop proteins that don't exist in the body for now, and maybe there would be a more stringent requirement for proteins that do exist in the body naturally. You know, generating a spike protein of a virus, or as Helen put it out in the chat over there, even an mRNA vaccine for Zika, is something that is perhaps more tangible at this point, rather than generating proteins that exist within the body, for maybe for the reason that it might not be known enough that, what they could do unless we really study that.
Yeah, great. Thanks for these answers. Any other questions that are coming to mind from participants that you're curious while we have these clinicians on the call?
I'm curious if there's been any, other than the questions you've addressed today, have there been other questions you're getting from patients in general, even beyond RB, for Ken, maybe from your broader oncology group, what you think patients really want to know?
Yeah, that's a great question. From the RB families, we get a lot of emails to ask, do we recommend the vaccine? And is there concerns about the mRNA interacting with the DNA? And so we've addressed those today. From my broader sort of patient population, we do know out there in the general population, there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy. Some of that is based perhaps on misinformation or not fully scientifically evidence-based information, but some of that is based on valid concerns. I think the most common sort of concerns that we get are, number one, this is such a new technology and we're just hesitant because it's new, right? Why did this vaccine have to be mRNA based and not sort of protein based like many other prior vaccines? And then this question about, well, we don't know what we don't know. What if there is a side effect and we're only going to discover it in 20 years? Why should I be sort of first in line? I think those are not sort of unevidence-based concerns. We have to sort of answer those questions by, again, making reasonable extrapolations from what we do know from the science and from the history of vaccines. So to the first question, why was the vaccine had to be based on mRNA and not protein itself? Dr. Malapatna did allude to that. A lot of the impetus was to get this vaccine developed as quickly as possible because we are dealing with a global pandemic and the death toll is in millions. And the mRNA being a sort of easy to develop molecule, easier than protein, it was able to be developed faster, tweaked faster, and more importantly, actually delivered and transported and administered in an easier way. So there was many technical advantages. I think if we had anticipated how much hesitancy there would be because of that concern, perhaps scientists could have said, let's go back to protein. But it's hard to know what hesitancy, will come from which reason. So I think it was the right thing to do to get this vaccine developed the way it was. And as Dr. Malapatna said, the technology has been around for decades. And of course, the molecule has been around for billions of years. In fact, mRNA was probably, I think people say, the first molecule of life developed on planet Earth, even prior to DNA or protein. So it's, I think and related to that, the idea that we know how mRNA works and we know what we can expect from it, and the mRNA is making the protein. If this might be a bit of a corny analogy, but the way I think of it is, a protein vaccine is kind of like if you order furniture from the brick and it comes to you fully formed, right? So you've ordered a TV table and the delivery man delivers a TV table. And the mRNA vaccine is kind of like ordering furniture from IKEA. It comes to you in a box and you have to do the assembly yourself. But as a result, it was much easier, faster to make a lot of sort of IKEA boxes and allow the body to do the assembly themselves. But because we know the mechanism of how it works, there's no reason to believe that the mRNA vaccine will have more toxicity or unknown side effects than the protein-based vaccines. They're one step prior, and so there's no reason to imagine anything different. And then so the other question is, well, it's a new vaccine, it's only been around a year. What if we discover side effects 20 years from now? That, of course, is a reasonable question. And again, you have to answer that by extrapolating from everything we know about vaccines over the last 50 years or so. We know how vaccines work. We know that it's an immune system. We know that vaccine side effects generally tend to be all in the same category, if you will. They tend to be immunologic side effects. So even when you talk about things like myocarditis or the inflammatory syndrome or the neurologic effects that were alluded to, these are all immunogenic based side effects. They come because you've activated your immune system. But there's no vaccine where we've seen side effects like an increased risk of cancer or infertility or those sort of things. And so we sort of know what side effects vaccines cause and what side effects they don't cause. I don't think what's going to happen is what movies scare us, and in 20 years we'll all discover something terrible has happened. We've all become have some side effect we didn't anticipate. I think we can say it's a very reasonable extrapolation about what we can anticipate the long-term side effects will be. And I think we've already seen most of them from the trials that we have done so far. I hope that's helpful. So those are two of the other questions that I think we often get from people who are very concerned about the vaccines. And then, as I mentioned before, everything has to be in balance, right? So we know the vaccine, yes, comes with these potential concerns, but we do know that COVID itself comes with those concerns. So COVID causes myocarditis, COVID causes inflammatory syndrome, and COVID causes, illness and death. And so on balance, we believe that the vaccine is the better choice for preventative care rather than risking the disease itself.
Amazing. Very insightful answer. Thank you. Any other questions at this point?
I think I'd just like to add one more thing there is that I have been asked by my patients if we will provide an exception to the vaccine based on the fact that they have germline retinoblastoma. And I think I would answer that question with no, we wouldn't provide that because we don't believe it makes that difference.
Amazing. Dr. Malapatna, Dr. Sheikh, thanks so much for your time this morning. Really, really do appreciate it. To all the participants on the line, thank you so much for joining us. By the way, if anyone's curious, moving forward, coming up next month, just as a quick kind of announcement, registration for our 2022 Retinoblastoma Research Symposium is now open. So that's going to be entirely virtual, but there's going to be a great gather town environment that you don't want to miss. So thank you, Damaris Lab, for sending over that link. Finally, just the last thing we're going to end on is we're just going to launch a quick poll to see how useful this the session was for you, so that we can look to improve our future online events. So if yeah, thank you for launching that poll. If you could take 20 seconds, you could take 20 seconds to answer these two questions. Let us know how informative the meeting was and how useful the information was in terms of being presented. And then if you want to let us know if there's any feedback you guys have, that would be great as well. Perfect. I'll give you maybe 30 seconds to answer that, and then we'll close off.
Thank you so much, Jay, and thank you to all the attendees. We appreciate your invitation.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Thanks, Ivana, and everybody else in the back end of this. I think you've addressed a lot of the questions that's pertinent in our clinics to some of our patients. So thanks.
Amazing. Well, happy holidays. I think we'll close the poll off, and then I will let you all go. Have an amazing Saturday, and yeah, have a great time off if you have it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, guys.